We'd like to discuss the fate of the secular project and the fate of the secular idea. Here is this secular conception of politics, which was alien to the Islamic world. The Islamic world didn't know the distinction between God's realm and Caesar's realm, yet secularism comes knocking at the gates of that world and reshapes its politics. Whenever I think about these subjects, I always begin with, again, forgive me for saying it this way, I begin with some of the basic remarks you yourself have taught us about the way Muslims view politics and the way Christendom viewed politics. And I think the way one of your many lessons to us is that in Christendom, one rendered unto God what's God, and one rendered unto Caesar what's Caesar. Now, in the Islamic tradition, it was different. Mm-hmm. It did not make that distinction between God's realm and Caesar's realm.
Right.
Until, I would think, again, learning from this vast subject and what you've written, then comes Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. And he introduces that fundamental distinction between God's realm and Caesar's realm. Is that a fair way?
Well, I wouldn't say he introduced it. It was already being discussed, but he made it part of the process of government.
Right.
He was the first to do that.
So he disestablished Islam.
Exactly. He decided that Turkey is a secular republic.
Right.
Now, it's curious. The discussion of secularism began with an initial difficulty, that there was no word in Arabic or Persian or Turkish for secular or secularism.
So this new word, Almani, for secular, is that new?
That's borrowed from the Christians.
Borrowed from the Christians.
I mean, Arabic, unlike Persian and Turkish, Arabic is a Christian language,
yes,
as well as a Muslim language. There were important Christian communities with an important Christian literature in Arabic. Christians needed a word for it, obviously. And
that's a very nice, that's something I hadn't, you would say Arabic is both a Muslim and a Christian language. Yes.
And the Arabic-speaking Christian communities provided that piece of vocabulary that was needed. In Turkish, there are no Turkish Christians, and the Turks didn't have a word for it, and they needed it more urgently because the language of government was Turkish.
So what did they do? Did they coin a term for it, or?
They did. They tried several, and it didn't work. The first one was Ladini.
Right. Non-religious.
Non-religious.
Yes.
But that could also mean irreligious.
Right.
And obviously that has a different application.
That's not a happy,
huh?
Yes.
No. Eventually they decided that they had to borrow a word. So the word that's used in Turkish is laik.
Right. Which
from
is
the
French. Right.
From the French.
Which is it shows you its alienness, if you will.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that's the word in the Turkish constitution and anywhere else where they need it. Laiklik is the abstract form.
So these traditions of secularism, you would take them back to the 20s and to the Kemalists.
I think so. There is some discussion before that, but it doesn't amount to very much. The first serious attempt was the Kemalist revolution in Turkey. The difference is very clear. In Christendom, the difference is there from the beginning.
Yes.
Because Christianity was the religion of a persecuted minority for centuries,
right,
before they succeeded in converting the emperor. Right. And after that, they could be the persecutors instead of the persecuted.
No,
but in Islam, it's the religion of the state from the beginning.
Right.
The first state is the Islamic state.
Right.
And the Prophet was not only the founder of religion, he was the founder of a state and indeed of an empire.
Now, betraying, I believe I am completely secular. La dini, we'll use that term. But I think there is probably some historiography in me buried deep by my Shia ancestors. And I have this thought about what happened in Islamic history, which is, of course, Shiaism given a kind of modern cast, which is that the Umayyad Empire was the first secular state. That the fall of the caliphate, after the death of the fourth caliph, after the assassination of Imam Ali, there begins the Umayyad world. And I have my sense of it is that this was a secular state. Is that completely is completely modernized.
That's a Shiite point of view.
It's a Shia point of view. I concede you this. So in a way, there is a...
Though at the time, even the Shia wouldn't have used that term.
How would they have...
They would have seen it as a usurper state.
Usurpers, exactly. So it was...
Not the same thing.
So the sword trumped the religious.
Yes.
I mean, that's how I would... Looking at the change of the caliphate, looking at the loss, looking at the shift of power from the Hijaz to Damascus, you can begin to argue that from the beginning Islam, though not in doctrine, knew a distinction between God's realm and Caesar's realm. That again, perhaps shaped by a certain Shia interpretation of history.
Yes.
I view Muawiyah and his son Yazid as thoroughly secular rulers. Is that just too much of a...
There is no word for secular.
Yes, there is no word for secular.
Those who approved them saw them as the proper religious leaders. Those who disapproved them saw them as usurpers.
Yes. So what happens, in fact, so the Kemalist doctrine comes into Turkey.
Yes.
And this is an avowedly secular doctrine.
It is now an avowedly secular doctrine. Right. It is part of the constitution of the Turkish state.
Okay.
And is strictly enforced for a very long time. You had this curious episode when the present government took power in Turkey. The Prime Minister went with his wife to Washington,
right,
where they were received by the President, and his wife wore the veil.
Right.
And there were pictures, of course, from various newspapers in Washington of the Turkish Prime Minister and his veiled wife being received in the White House by the President and his wife. Now, in Turkey, that was impossible.
Right.
Because women are not allowed to wear the veil in public places.
Right.
So you had the paradoxical situation that the Turkish Prime Minister's wife had more freedom in Washington than in Ankara.
Right. It is a great irony.
It is a great irony.
Yes.
And he staged it deliberately. And
yes.
He knew what he was doing, and very effectively.
Which is a way of sticking it to the Kemalists
exactly.
and to the modernists, saying, look, even the West tolerates this.
Yes.
But you folks are more royalist than the king, if you will.
Right.
You know, more secular than the West.
And more Catholic than the Pope.
Exactly, so to speak. Now, what happens in the successor states to the Ottoman Empire and the Arab states? They're watching the performance of the Turkish state.
Yes.
They see that Kemal is a big success. Do they not see it this way? Is that not?
They don't seem to have been interested in borrowing that particular aspect of Kemalism.
Is that right? I mean, is it like Kemal, like what would we say, where did Kemalism, as it plays out in Turkey, now in the rest of the Islamic world, is this experiment being admired, emulated, followed? Are people damning the Turks for having abandoned Islam? Or some of them being inspired by them?
At the time, there were some who were inspired. But I'm not aware of any other Muslim state that went as far as the Turks in disestablishing Islam.
Right. No one went as far.
No.
Okay, what about the Arab states at this period? Now they are under the mandatory states.
I mean, there's usually some sort of clause in the constitution or in the basic laws. Sometimes it says Islam is the law of is the religion of the state. Sometimes it says Sharia is the principal source of legislation.
Right.
That's a form frequently used. Some indication of the priority of Islam.
Now, was the Wafd interlude in Egypt from the 1920s until the fall of the monarchy in 1952, was this a fairly secular enterprise?
Fairly secular, yes.
Right. The Copts were prominent in the life of the country.
It was fairly secular, though I don't think they made any change in the law or the constitution.
Right. Now, what about the national security states, i.e., someone like Nasser steps forth, claims power, puts the Muslim Brotherhood to flight, hangs Sayyid Qutb, the future Lenin, if you will, of the Islamists. And that's a secular enterprise, is it not?
Oh, certainly, yes. But it's an alien notion.
Right.
And at the present time, I would say, is increasingly being rejected.
Right. Now, to broaden the discussion just a bit from the Arab states, I've always been interested in what happened in Pakistan, because you have an irony in Pakistan, that the Muslim assimilates, the Muslim modernist, a man by the name of M.A. Jinnah, he wasn't even known as Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he was M.A. Jinnah Esquire, a barrister at law, who leads the Muslims of India into this promised land of Pakistan. He himself was married to a Parsi woman. He himself favored Scotch as his drink. He did not, he was a Khoja, he was a Ismaili by, I believe, from a very marginal community. And if you take a look at Jinnah and his vision of Pakistan, it was a very secular vision. Is that false? Or?
It was, I wouldn't say very secular, it was rather secular. I mean, for him and many like him, Islam was not so much a religion as an identity.
Right.
It was their distinguishing feature. It was what marked them off from the Hindus.
Right. Well, I mean, I think in the case of Jinnah, and I've spent some time, he's interested me a great deal, and I've spent quite a bit of time reading about him and around him. Because what Jinnah was, he was, let's say, as much of a Muslim as Herzl was Jewish. Neither one of them was religious.
Right.
These are people who came to the political world and they realized that they were being defined, that in fact, when the doors were slammed shut in the face of Herzl, he became a Zionist. And in the aftermath of, the known history, in the aftermath of the Dreyfus trial and so on.
Right.
In the case of Jinnah discovered that this new world, occasioned by the fall of the British, would be a Hindu world in India.
The overwhelming majority.
Exactly, and not only that, they were the overwhelming majority, but the Muslims had fallen behind the Hindus in that crucial 100 years between the mutiny in 1857-58 and the partition in 1947. So I see Jinnah as this kind of, I think Pakistan was a default choice of people who have fallen behind. And the idea was not to have a religious state.
No, I think they saw Islam not so much as a religion in the strict sense of the word, but rather as an identity, as a political and cultural identity. I visited Pakistan only once, and that was quite early in the history of the state. And it was really quite amusing. For example, as it was officially a Muslim state, alcohol is forbidden, but it was readily available. Any hotel or restaurant would be able to serve drinks, officially only for non-Muslims. But Muslims could have them too, provided that they were certified alcoholics.
Yes, they have to have a statement that they're certified alcoholics.
Yes, if they are certified.
It's a forgiving world. Yes.
If they are certified alcoholics, so to speak, can't live without it.
I think of something again that you wrote about a point of rupture, if you will, that there is a piece you wrote called The Return of Islam, which is, of course, both the title is memorable and the phenomenon, that I think that we can look back on, particularly the rise of Islamism in Arab politics. To use an expression from a colleague, it was on the 7th day of the 6-day war that Islamism begins. It's on the 7th day of the 6-day war. Because
that's an interesting thought.
Right, on the 7th day, because these regimes, particularly the Syrians and the Egyptians, and I remember that piece very well. You had begun the piece on the return of Islam by an article that appeared in the magazine of the armed forces of the Syrians. That was somewhat, it didn't show enough regard and respect for Islam. So when these national security states, these ideological states, these dictatorships, modern dictatorships, when they fell in defeat, when they were overrun, when they were overwhelmed in the 6-day war, the Islamists then, in fact, they regarded this as a verdict from the heavens.
Right.
And they read this as a defeat of the maybe perhaps it wasn't a secular project, but this is the way they saw it.
Yes.
That this was the secular project.
Yes. And they didn't make any clear distinction between non-religious and irreligious.
Right. And I think they even didn't have any grief. They didn't feel any sorrow for the defeat of their national armies.
No.
Indeed, they had a fair amount of what the Arabs would call shamata, schadenfreude, over the defeat of Nasser and the defeat of the Syrians. That if the Egyptians regime are torturing the Muslim Brotherhood and defeating them, look what's happening to you on the battlefield.
Yes. A defeat at the hands of a state, the very identity of which is defined in terms of a religion.
So where is secularism in the Arab world, more narrowly in the Arab world today?
Well, it's still there, but I think it's under siege, shall we say.
Is Saudi Arabia a secular state?
I don't think so.
Would you, I mean, there is the House of Saud, and there is Al Sheikh, the religious establishment.
Yeah.
And they are partners in...
Yeah. I think it might be useful to distinguish between religious and ecclesiastical.
Okay. So would you say that Saudi Arabia is an ecclesiastical state?
Yes. It doesn't strike me as particularly religious.
Not particularly religious.
No.
And in fact, the Wahhabi religious class is very subordinated to the monarchy.
Exactly.
And relies on the monarchy for its treasure, for its
Right.
subsidy. So is the secular project on the ropes? Is that it? I mean...
At the moment, I don't think it's faring very well. It's also a question of identity. How do you define your identity?
Right.
And as we saw earlier, I mean, for a very long time, the basic definition of identity was by religion.
Right.
Of one's own and that of other people.
Right.
I mean, all these different terms of nationality, by country, by ethnicity, and so on. This is all modern.
Right.
And all relatively unimportant in the larger perspective of history.